Hey everyone, Neemanem here from Blender Discord. Welcome back to the channel. It's January 2025 and we just got a massive info dump from Pablo in the latest Blender Today Live. It's great to have him back, and even better, Blender Today Live is officially returning as a bi-weekly show. That's right, a new episode every other week. Before we dive in, make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future updates, and come join us over on the Blender Discord. The link is in the description below. We've got a great community going, and it's the perfect place to discuss all things Blender, get help with your projects, and connect with other artists. There's a ton to cover from the live streams, so let's jump right in, starting with some big news about the Blender Conference. First up, mark your calendars. Blender Conference is getting a change of scenery, or rather a change of season. Instead of its usual October slot, it's moving to September of 2025. Pablo mentioned that they're hoping for some nicer weather in Amsterdam that time of year. Before we get into the future, let's take a quick look back at 2024. Blender had a really productive year, pushing out 3 major releases, 4.1, 4.2 long-term support, and 4.3 long-term support. Each of these brought some serious upgrades to the table. We're talking about the new Eevee Next render engine, a completely revamped Grease Pencil 3, and a totally reworked compositor that's faster and more powerful. And those are just a few highlights. There are also a bunch of smaller projects like Project Gold, and a stream of updates and workshops to keep everyone in the loop. So what's on the horizon for 2025? Well, Blender team is kicking off the year with what they're calling the Winter of Quality. Now that might not sound super exciting, but trust me, it is important. It means that they're putting a major focus on squashing bugs, improving stability, and generally making Blender a smoother and more reliable experience. So if you've been encountering pesky bugs, now is the absolute perfect time to report them. The developers are actively listening and prioritizing fixes. Now let's talk about some of the exciting projects Blender team is cooking up. It's important to note that these are future projects planned after Blender 4.4. They've got a bunch on their plate, but here are a few that really stand out. One area they're focusing on improving is how different parts of Blender work together. Specifically, they want to make the shader editor, compositor, and geometry nodes integrate more seamlessly together. This will streamline workflows and make it easier to create complex effects. This is a long-term goal that goes beyond the geometry node improvements of 4.4. Another major project is the introduction of project-defined variables. This is going to be a game changer for larger projects. It allows different blend files within the same project to communicate and share information, which will make managing complex scenes much easier. They're also working on something called remote assets. Imagine having access to a huge online library of assets that you can pull directly into your Blender scene. That's the vision, and it sounds amazing. Performance is always a top priority, and they're continuing to optimize various parts of Blender. Specifically, they've mentioned ongoing performance work for Eevee Next, sculpting tools, and multi-resolution modifier. For those of you that work with tablets and pens, you'll be happy to hear that a better support is on the way. In what form, we don't know just yet, but hopefully in the future there's more information. They're also putting a lot of effort into making Blender a more powerful storytelling tool. This involves improving integration between the sequencer, Grease Pencil, and other editorial features, making it even better for storyboarding, creating animatics, and more. Of course, they're not neglecting the core rendering engines. Cycles and NPR development continues, with Dylan Gu Studios lending a hand on the non-photorealistic rendering side. And for those that have been following the development of the Vulkan backend, that work is still ongoing. They're also planning further improvements on how Blender handles USD and GLTF files, which is great for interoperability with other software. And last but not least, animation is getting some love. They're working on layered animation systems that should give animators a lot more flexibility and control. Also mentioned in the QA that we'll get to in a moment, you can look forward to node-based physics systems. Alright, let's shift gears and talk about Blender 4.4. Everything in this section is a part of Blender 4.4 release. This is a major update packed with new features and improvements. In the realm of animation and rigging, one of the standout additions is something called slotted actions. This is a really clever way to organize your animations. You can now group multiple actions like movement of an object and the zoom of a camera into one single action. It's a huge time saver and makes managing complex animations much simpler. They've also refined the F-curve noise modifier, giving you more control over the procedural animation. Moving on to the compositor, they've added support for integer sockets, which opens up new possibilities for node-based workflows. The Open Image Denoise node now has a quality setting, so you can fine-tune the balance between speed and denoising quality. But the biggest news in the compositor is the completely revamped glare node. It's way more flexible and user-friendly now. You've got individual controls for all the parameters, separate outputs for the glare and highlights, and new strength input to really dial in the effect. In Core Blender, we see they've made it possible to customize the splash screen using environment variables, add in support for H.265 encoding, which is great for smaller file sizes without sacrificing quality. There are also some new options for the render audio operator, including support for the AIC format and Opus codec. Cycles rendering gets an upgrade with improvements to NVIDIA Optics Denoiser, resulting in cleaner renders. The sample subset feature also has been modified, which is particularly useful for those doing distributed rendering across multiple machines. The Eevee and viewport section has seen a significant behind-the-scenes change with a complete rewrite to the overlay system. While you may not see a huge difference immediately, this lays the groundwork for better performance and more advanced features in the future. The user interface has received a lot of polish. There's a new option to lock the rotation directly in the sidebar, which is super handy. The asset browser now lets you sort assets by catalog, making it easier to find what you need, and you can even remove asset previews you don't like. They've also made a bunch of small improvements to tooltips, node visuals, and front rendering just to make the overall Blender experience more pleasant. For geometry node users, there are new collection and object input nodes, as well as find in string node for working with text. Performance has also been improved for the triangulate and sort elements nodes, making them significantly faster. Grease Pencil artists will be happy to see the return of some operators from 4.2 long-term support, and layered groups can now have color tags for better organization. In the modeling and UV department, they've added a new way to select poles based on their traits, and the join triangles operator is now smarter, prioritizing the creation of quads for cleaner typology. On the pipeline, assets, and input and output front, Blender now supports animated volumes in USD exports, and they've been adding material displacement support to the USD implementation. And finally, the video sequence editor has received some major love. Probably the most exciting addition is the ability to edit text strips directly in the preview. No more fiddling around in the sidebar. You can now just click and type right where your text appears in the video. They've also improved text alignment for multi-line text strips, and you can even add rounded corners to text background. Plus, they've made some serious performance improvements, so things like proxy building and HDR playback should be much smoother. Beyond the technical stuff, Pablo also talked about the community. The 2% campaign to encourage donations to the Blender Development Fund was a big success, significantly increasing the number of individual donors. And in a cool bit of news, Qualcomm has joined the Blender Development Fund as a corporate sponsor. If you would like to donate to Blender, please visit their donations page on blender.org. He also mentioned that Blender Community's website will be phased out, but they're considering replacing it with something else, possibly based on Discourse. And for those who use right-click select, that platform will likely be moving to a new, more official home. During the Q&A, Pablo touched on a few interesting topics. He talked about the decision to move to Blender 5.0, saying it's an opportunity to clean up the codebase and keep Blender more lean. He also briefly mentioned AI, suggesting that it could be useful for automating certain tasks like UV mapping and rigging in the future. Lastly, he also mentioned that node-based physics are on the roadmap, with aerodynamics being one of the first areas they would like to tackle. So what's in the immediate future? Well, Blender 4.4 beta is scheduled to drop early February 2025, and Blender 4.5 alpha will soon follow after. As for Blender 5.0, they're aiming for November 2025, but as always, that is subject to change. That's it for this Blender Today Live. I know it was a bit long, but I'm recapping 2 hours of video here, so hopefully I covered everything. Let me know if I seem to have missed something that they talked about, or if I got something wrong. It was a lot to go through, a lot to record, and I hope you enjoy it. As you can see here, there's a ton happening in Blender. Remember, Blender Today is back to a bi-weekly show, so hopefully these recaps and the show itself will be much shorter in the future. Be sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, like it, and join the Discord in the link below.